If you glance at the international section of any corporate news site right now, you will see a very carefully manicured and sanitized version of what's happening in South America. The talking heads use sterile diplomatic language. They talk about contested electoral outcomes, diplomatic standoffs, and regional instability. They use that academic jargon to hide a brutal, bloody reality because the truth completely dismantles their preferred narrative. What we're witnessing in Venezuela is not a political disagreement. It is the total, predictable fallout of a socialist dictatorship that has weaponized the state against its own people to maintain power at all costs. Nicolas Maduro and his criminal regime didn't win an election. They executed a corporate-style consolidation of power using military force, state-run media, and armed paramilitary gangs. The corporate press is desperate to avoid a real post-game breakdown of this crisis because it forces them to admit two things they hate. First, that socialism always ends in tyranny and starvation. And second, that the collapse of law and order down there has created a direct national security threat right here on American soil. We have to look closely at how the media covers the Maduro regime's survival. For years, the progressive left in this country painted Venezuela as a beacon of democratic socialism. They praised their state-subsidized programs and their rhetoric about redistributing wealth. But when the currency collapsed, when the grocery store shelves went completely bare, and when millions of citizens began fleeing the country just to find a piece of bread, those same Western elites suddenly developed amnesia. And now they want you to believe that Maduro's continued grip on power is just a localized Latin American political issue. They run segments focusing entirely on international sanctions, implying that if the United States would just play nice and stop restricting Venezuela's state-owned oil company, the suffering would just magically stop. This is an upside-down lie. The economic devastation of Venezuela wasn't caused by outside pressure. It was caused by internal plunder. Maduro and his inner circle dismantled the separation of powers, packed the courts with loyalists, and stripped independent businesses of their property. When the population stood up to protest, the regime didn't debate them. They turned off the internet, deployed the colectivos, their state-sanctioned biker gangs, and then locked up political dissidents in cells beneath Caracas. This is the permanent end state of the socialist blueprint. It starts with promises of equity and free resources, and it ends with unaccountable elite using tanks to crush the working class. The media covers up this reality because they're trying to implement the exact same bureaucratic consolidation in your own institutions. And they don't want you to see where that road inevitably leads. The real fallout of the Maduro regime isn't contained within the borders of South America. It's crossed our wide open southern border, and it's actively destabilizing American cities. While the media runs high-minded pieces about regional diplomacy, they are completely silent about the export of Venezuelan violent crime directly in our backyards. Under the guise of a refugee crisis, the Maduro regime has actively emptied its prisons and allowed transnational gang structures, most notably the Tren de Aragua syndicate, to travel unimpeded through the migrant pipelines directly into the United States. This isn't a theory. It's an operational reality being dealt with by local police departments from Miami to New York City to Chicago. These are criminal enterprises born in the lawless state-run prisons of Venezuela. They specialize in human trafficking, retail theft rings, and brutal violence. They operate with a level of ruthlessness that our local law enforcement infrastructure hasn't had to face in decades. Yet, when a local sheriff tries to warn his community about the rise of Venezuelan gang activity in his county, the protest industrial complex steps in. They label the sheriff as a xenophobe. They bury the statistics. And the corporate news networks refuse to run the story. I'm watching a deliberate attempt to protect a radical leftist regime abroad while sacrificing the safety of independent American families at home. They want you to look at the border crisis as an isolated humanitarian event rather than what it actually is: the weaponization of mass migration by an adversarial dictatorship. Maduro knew exactly what he was doing. By exporting his country's instability, he relieves the internal pressure on his regime while simultaneously straining our social safety nets, our judicial system, and our police forces. It's an act of asymmetrical warfare, and the permanent political class in Washington is letting it happen. The Venezuela fallout is a stark, undeniable warning. It proves that when you surrender the rule of law, when you let unelected elites control the economy, and when you allow the state to dismantle your constitutional guardrails, the descent into tyranny happens faster than anyone thinks possible. Don't let the media's sterile coverage blind you to the stakes of this fight. The chaos we see in Caracas is the literal blueprint for what happens when a government decides it no longer answers to its citizens. Protect your local community. Support the law enforcement officers fighting this imported lawlessness on our streets. And never apologize for standing up for an America that is secure, sovereign, and free. Stand with me, support the mission, refuse the silence, and I'll see you next time.